Restoring the ecosystem and its rivers and removing dams will bring back the water cycle to life and reduce droughts, fires, and floods. If you take a look at a picture of the US here, you can see that the rivers are kind of like the lifeblood of the system. They are very similar to the veins in our body. The water vapor in the air gets blown inland, and then it forms rain and comes down on the landscape. And that flows down the rivers. And some of that river water then goes into neighboring floodplains, or into the wetlands, or into the riparian vegetation. And as it goes into that soil and vegetation next to the river, it can then get evapotranspired back up into the air. And so then it then flows from up in the air further inland and then comes down again. So you can think somewhat as that there can be kind of small streams of water vapor up in the atmosphere, and those are kind of like the arteries. So they're bringing the blood of the water inland after being pumped up into the air by the trees, because trees evapotranspire a lot more than just bare ground. And then it comes back down, and then it's like the rivers are like the veins that bring the blood back to the heart, or bring the water back to the pump of the trees. So there's that. So that's the small water cycle, where the water flows and doesn't flow all the way back out to the ocean, but then goes back up in the air and then blows inland, comes back down again. And then some of that river water also goes all the way to the ocean, and then the ocean also evaporates water and blows inland. And so that's the large water cycle. So there's two parts to the water cycle. There's a large water cycle from the ocean to the land and back, and then small water cycle where it's from the land up into the air and then back down to the land. And what's what's happening in many places around the world is that we're damming up all of these rivers. And so the US, we have over 8,000 dams. So this is causing a lot of problems, because now the rivers are running more dry. And so we don't have as much of this circulation. And this circulation is really important, because as you have more life, more vegetation, and more animals, then when that biomass decays, it forms soil. And so this soil is really important to then generate more life, more vegetation, because that vegetation is the pump of pumping the water back up into the air and further inland. And so if you don't have all the soil and all this vegetation, then this whole small water cycle begins to decay. And then what happens is you have less rainfall. And the soil itself is very important, because the more organic content in the soil, the more it can actually absorb rainfall, because there's more little pockets as the microbes create little air pockets, and the fungi are able to also absorb the water. And so the less rainfall that the soil can absorb, then more of that's going to go in the rivers and flow out to the sea. And so there's also from that soil absorption aspect, less water going back up into the sky, and also being held in the landscape for longer. Because if that water immediately runs off to the river and goes quickly to the ocean, then that water isn't necessarily available into the dry season. So those rivers can also run dry into the dry season. But if the water's seeping slowly through the soil and through some of the underground aspects, then that river can actually be running all the way into the dry season, because it takes a couple of months sometimes for that water to go through the soil and the underground to reach the river. So so the question arises of where is all that dam water going? So what we're doing in our society is actually diverting a lot of that dam water to a lot of this modern farms and to our urban environments. And the problem is in all of these these modern farms, is that there's irrigation pipes under the soil, and so a lot of that soil water is not staying in the farm itself. It's just being drained again. And also some of that water is now being diverted to the urban environments, where a lot of that water then also gets funneled very quickly to the ocean. And so that water, because it's being funneled so quickly, is not growing a lot of the vegetation as much. Um, so in order to bring back a lot of the rainfall in drought areas like in the southwestern U.S. or in parts of Africa, in parts of South America that are experiencing drought, in Spain, parts of the Mediterranean that are experiencing drought. We really have to look at the effect that these dams have, and of where the dams are feeding the water to these modern farms and to the urban cities. And so what we can do is we can start dismantling a lot of these dams, and as these dams are dismantled, that soil which was accumulating in the dams and not being used can then actually, if it's done correctly, actually go back downriver and into the environment. And so that soil can then, because you need that soil to generate the vegetation that generates the biotic pumps up into the air. And so we can allow that process of the soil to uh, be integrated into the environment again. And then if we release animals like beavers in the US or in the UK where they originally were, these beavers are very good at actually helping create little small check dams in the rivers that then cause the river to overflow into the floodplains. These floodplains then grow more vegetation, which can then help evapotranspire more water up into the air. And so what happens as we remove some of these dams is that we're restoring both the water cycle and the vegetation soil cycle. And those two cycles are very interlinked because you need the water to enhance the soil and the vegetation to grow. And then you need the soil cycle because the soil is what absorbs more of the rainfall and holds it in the landscape longer. And because the vegetation is what then transpires the water up into the air. And so these are the two very interlinked cycles. And what happens when you remove the dams is that the soil that was in sediment that's been trapped in these dams then gets a chance to actually flow downriver and become integrated into the environment so that it can further generate more of the water cycle. And so in drought areas, the rainfall can now actually get restored. And so this also helps with fires because a lot of the fires that are happening is because the landscapes become so dry. And interestingly, this also will help in flood-prone areas because as there's more wetlands and floodplains next to the rivers that are there, then the water, when it does overflood, it can actually go into the wetlands and then actually then over time enter into the aquifers. And also, there's a feedback loop between the river and the vegetation. As there's year-round water in the rivers, then more vegetation will grow next to the rivers, which actually will then cause the river to slow down more. And as these rivers slow down more, the floods also weaken in power. And as there's more vegetation around, there's also less speed to the rainfall when it hits the ground, and less landslides. And because the water will get slowed down upstream, often it doesn't get a chance to really gain a lot of huge velocity and strength when it hits the urban areas further downstream, downhill. And so that's why restoring our ecosystem and dismantling a lot of the dam systems will help restore our water cycle and deal with climate change.